Welcome to the debate. If you hold two strong magnets close together, like right before they touch, you feel it, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
There is this undeniable invisible resistance, or you flip one around and you feel an invisible attraction.
Right, but you can't actually see it.
Exactly. You can't see it, you can't photograph it, and if you slice the magnet open under a microscope, you will literally never find it, but you still feel the sheer weight of it in your hands.
Yeah, because you cannot isolate a single molecule of magnetism, we map the phenomenon entirely through its effects.
Right.
Like we scatter iron filings across a piece of paper, we watch them arrange themselves into those sweeping arcs, and from that observable, repeatable behavior, we deduce the existence of the magnetic field.
But what happens when the field we are talking about is not magnetic, but existential?
Okay, existential.
Yeah. What happens when the invisible forces binding us to our suffering or pulling us toward consequence are concepts like human attachment or karma? Today, we are examining the profound tension between strict materialism and spiritual philosophy.
Which is a massive topic.
It is. Specifically, we're focusing on how each worldview accounts for the unseen forces that govern reality.
And our discourse today is grounded in the essay titled The Man Who Demanded a Molecule of Karma. This text, it examines this really fascinating online exchange between a strict materialist and a spiritual seeker.
Right, and the catalyst for their clash was actually a claim about human attachment, which rapidly escalated into this fundamental dispute over epistemology, like, can we and should we demand physical proof for spiritual concepts? So the central question we are exploring today is whether the materialists' demand for physical, empirical proof of a spiritual framework is a logical necessity for discerning truth, or if it's, well, a fundamental category error that completely ignores how much of our reality actually relies on the unseen.
Right.
So from my position, I will argue that demanding physical evidence, literally asking to see an atom of karma, is a profound metaphysical category error, revealing an unrecognized faith in materialistic assumptions.
And I will argue that equating subjective spiritual frameworks with empirical physical laws is a false equivalence that completely undermines definitional precision.
All right, so let's just look directly at the materialist's opening challenge in the text. He asks, quote, care to show us a single atom of karma or one molecule of spirituality?
Which is a pretty blunt way to put it.
It is. It is. It is the ultimate category error masquerading as rigorous science. It is exactly like asking, what is the exact physical weight of the number 7?
Well,
Or, what color is Tuesday? It just assumes that all that is real must be reducible to physical building blocks.
right, but
But wait, logic itself dictates the structure of coherent thought, right? And no one has ever isolated a molecule of human logic. Materialism operates on its own unacknowledged faith.
faith? I wouldn't call it faith.
It is. It trusts in theoretical models and unseen architectures, yet dismisses the unseen architectures of human consciousness simply because they do not fit inside a particle accelerator. Realities like meaning or the binding nature of attachment are undeniably real. To dismiss them because they cannot be weighed on a scale is to fundamentally misunderstand the architecture of reality.
Okay, but see, I think you are attacking the rhetorical clumsiness of the materialist rather than the epistemological boundary he is instinctually trying to protect.
How so?
Because comparing karma to a physical force like gravity conflates entirely different domains of knowledge. Gravity operates completely devoid of human consciousness.
Sure.
A stone drops at exactly the same rate for a saint and a murderer, right? It is an objective phenomenon. Karma, conversely, requires a human mind.
Well, it requires a subject, yes.
Exactly. It relies on intentionality, moral development, and a highly subjective framework of meaning. When the text attempts to elevate spiritual laws to the exact same ontological status as physical laws, it just dilutes the definition of what a scientific law actually is. Maintaining a strict boundary here is not closed-mindedness. It is the absolute baseline for clarity.
Okay, you draw a really hard line between physical laws and spiritual inferences, but look at how physical laws are actually constructed.
They're constructed through math and measurement.
Are they? The materialist in the text defends gravity by pointing to gravitons, These particles created by mass that warp space-time.
Yes, standard quantum physics.
But the graviton is a purely hypothetical particle. No physicist in history has ever actually detected one. It is a conceptual bridge. It's just a placeholder born out of the intuition that quantum mechanics and general relativity must somehow meet. So the materialist rests his absolute certainty on a particle that exists entirely in faith. Both the graviton and karma are simply inferences drawn from observed effects.
Wait, hold on. You are equating a strict mathematical constraint with a mystical belief, and they are really not the same thing.
They are both unseen constructs.
But the graviton is not just a wild philosophical guess. We understand exactly how it must function because the mathematics of quantum field theory practically demand it.
Mathematical demands aren't physical proof.
Let me finish. General relativity describes gravity as a smooth curve in space-time, right? While quantum mechanics describes the universe in discrete, choppy packets. To bridge them, the mathematical symmetry of the universe requires a very specific particle. If the graviton exists, the math dictates it must have a spin of 2 and a mass of 0.
Okay.
It is highly constrained, and most importantly, it is mathematically falsifiable. Karma has no such constraints.
I disagree.
Think about it. If a bad thing happens to a good person, the spiritual framework just expands to absorb it. People say, oh, it is karma from a past life, or it is a hidden lesson. Because it explains every possible outcome, it predicts absolutely nothing.
See, you are trying to measure a river with a voltmeter.
A voltmeter?
Yes, it reads 0, so you just declare that the water is a myth. The fact that karma cannot be mathematically modeled does not mean it is not real. It just means you are using the wrong instrument.
So what is the right instrument then?
Karma is not measured by the Large Hadron Collider. It is measured by the instrument of consciousness itself.
That sounds highly subjective.
It is felt, the subtle bondage that tightens in the mind when we invest our entire identity in impermanent things. That is a tangibly felt reality in the inner landscape.
Measuring something strictly with your consciousness is exactly the problem here.
Why?
Saying karma is felt with the whole being is like claiming a software bug can be measured by observing how frustrated the programmer gets.
That is not.
The frustration is intense, sure, and it is undeniably real to the programmer, but it tells us absolutely nothing about the actual lines of code causing the crash. You need objective diagnostics.
But human experience isn't code.
Gravity drops an airplane out of the sky whether the passengers believe in it or not. The so-called weight of attachment only exists if you happen to possess the specific cognitive framework to interpret your normal human anxiety through a spiritual lens.
But your software analogy assumes human experience can be neatly separated from the code. It cannot. The frustration of the programmer is the phenomenon we're discussing.
I think that's dodging the need for proof.
It's really not. And to see how real and universal that phenomenon is, we need to look at the specific claim that triggered this entire dispute in the text.
Ah, yes, the procreation argument.
Exactly. The text centers on the assertion that having children generates the most karma because it represents the absolute strongest attachment to the material world. It is the ultimate investment in samsara.
Wait, I need to stop you right there.
Go ahead.
Are you seriously arguing that the biological foundation of our species, like a parent's love for their child, is just a karmic trap?
I'm saying.
Because if so, this spiritual framework is not just unscientific, it is profoundly anti-human. The evolutionary imperative to procreate and protect our young is the literal wellspring of human altruism, cooperation, and meaning.
No one is denying biology.
But to view that deep, necessary bond merely as Maya, a cosmic illusion, or some subtle bondage that needs to be transcended, that is a massive philosophical overreach. It takes the most vital human experience in existence and completely pathologizes it.
It is not pathologizing love, it is diagnosing the mechanics of attachment. We need to define samsara not as some mystical, magical reincarnation, but in grounded psychological terms.
Okay, let's hear the psychological terms.
Samsara is the continuous cycle of seeking permanent security in temporary, changing things. When a parent hinges their entire existential meaning on a child, believing that the child's success or mere existence will permanently fulfill them, they set themselves up for profound suffering.
because life is unpredictable.
Exactly. Because that child is an independent, fragile being subject to time, disease, and change. This is what the text means by spiritual physics. You are anchoring yourself to the heaviest possible object in the material world.
But calling it an anchor implies we'd be better off floating away. Biology wired us for that exact attachment because it ensures the survival of the species.
Survival of the species is the baseline, yes. But spiritual physics asks what happens to the individual mind after survival is secured.
Which is a luxury of philosophy.
Maybe, but this brings us to the ultimate paradox highlighted in the text. The materialist mocks the concept of karma, right? Yet by anchoring his entire framework of meaning to his genetics and his offspring, he embodies it perfectly.
I don't see how that follows.
He doesn't ask for a molecule of parenthood to justify his fierce devotion to his family. He accepts that invisible bond as absolute reality. He is so thoroughly enmeshed in the material drama of legacy and biology that the mere suggestion of non-attachment looks to him like a delusion.
Well,
He demands physical proof of karma, while acting as the most exquisite living proof of its invisible grip.
okay, that is a very clever rhetorical trap, but it is a completely closed loop.
How is it a closed loop?
It operates on this premise of, if you agree with me, you understand spiritual truth. But if you disagree with me, well, your disagreement is just a symptom of your deep karmic blindness.
That's an oversimplification.
It seals the spiritual framework off from any genuine empirical critique. The materialist does not have a spiritual illness. He might just be refusing to adopt a metaphysical worldview that demands he view his profound love for his children as some cosmic liability.
But that assumes the materialist worldview is the objective default, when in reality it requires its own massive leaps of faith.
Materialism isn't faith, it's observable reality.
Strict materialism, the belief that physical matter is the fundamental and only substance of the universe, is not a scientific finding. It is a philosophical assumption.
It's an assumption based on evidence.
But believing that your biological legacy provides permanent meaning in a universe governed by entropy requires enormous faith. Contemplative traditions do not demand blind belief. They demand rigorous investigation in what the text calls the inner laboratory.
First-person verification is an oxymoron in science. The inner laboratory is not a laboratory at all.
It is, if you understand how the methodology actually works. These traditions offer specific, testable protocols.
Like meditation?
Yes. You sit, you isolate a variable, say a physical pain or an acute emotional craving. You observe it without reacting. You watch the mechanics of your own suffering construct themselves in real time, and then you observe them dissolve when you remove the psychological fuel of attachment.
Subjectively?
But this is empirical observation in the first person. It has been peer-reviewed by thousands of practitioners over millennia who cross-reference these exact, precise stages of consciousness. The arrogant error of the materialist is assuming that only the outer laboratory matters, while remaining entirely blind to the forces governing his own internal reactions.
The outer laboratory exists precisely because our inner laboratories are notoriously defective.
Defective?
Yes. We are pattern-seeking primates. We suffer from pareidolia. We are biologically hardwired to see faces in random clouds.
Sure, visual tricks.
Not just visual tricks. We suffer from confirmation bias and emotional reasoning. Neuroscience shows us exactly how the brain generates these profound subjective states through shifting neurotransmitters and default mode network suppression.
Which just describes the physical correlation, not the experience.
You use an analogy from the text suggesting the materialist is standing on the ocean floor demanding a bottled sample of wetness, right? While the spiritual seeker is simply swimming in reality.
Yes, it perfectly captures the absurdity of demanding physical evidence for an all-encompassing experiential reality.
It captures a poetic sentiment, I'll give you that, but it completely fails epistemologically.
How so?
From a rigorous standpoint, the materialist is not standing in the ocean. The materialist is standing in a desert, looking at what the spiritual seeker claims is a vast, invisible ocean, and simply asking for a reliable physical test to ensure it isn't just a mirage.
A mirage?
Yes. The brain is an incredibly powerful mirage generator. Science, with its rigid demands for mathematical constraints, predictive power, and physical molecules, is simply the tool we invented to stop hallucinating water when we are thirsty.
But materialism is like trying to analyze a television broadcast by exclusively cataloging the glass, the wires, and the plastic of the screen, while completely ignoring the invisible broadcast signal that actually creates the picture. You can map the neurochemistry of the brain all you want, but measuring a spike in dopamine does not explain the lived, subjective qualia of love or the visceral burden of grief.
We are getting closer to mapping it every year.
But you'll never find the meaning in the molecule. The insistence on finding a physical molecule of karma ultimately exposes the rigid limitations of strict materialism.
And what are those limitations exactly?
The limitation is that it creates a worldview that leans heavily on unseen theoretical constructs like the graviton or dark matter, or the mathematical symmetries of quantum fields, yet completely refuses to engage with the invisible architectures of meaning, suffering, and consciousness.
Because they aren't physical forces.
Navigating human existence requires trust in the unseen. The materialist trusts in the unseen forces of physics to hold matter together. The spiritual seeker trusts in the unseen mechanics of consciousness to resolve suffering.
But one builds airplanes and the other builds philosophies.
Denying that you operate on faith doesn't make you more objective. It just makes you blind to the very forces shaping your behavior. The materialist in this exchange clung aggressively to his need to be right, entirely unaware that his aggression was the exact psychological bondage the seeker was trying to point out.
Okay, I will grant that the interpersonal dynamics of the exchange heavily favor the seeker.
Definitely.
The seeker's composure is a mark of psychological maturity, while the materialist's aggression is quite defensive. But we must decouple the behavior of the debaters from the truth value of their fundamental claims.
Fair enough.
Just because the spiritual seeker was calm does not mean their claims about the metaphysical physics of karma are objectively true. And just because the materialist was abrasive does not invalidate his demand for empirical grounding.
So where does that leave your position on the boundaries of reality?
It leaves me here. Concepts like karma, attachment, and samsara provide incredibly rich, psychologically resonant lenses for understanding the human condition.
Absolutely.
They offer invaluable tools for navigating the friction of life. However, maintaining a firm definitional boundary between testable empirical forces like gravity and interpretive spiritual philosophies like karma is the only way we maintain intellectual clarity.
Right.
The materialist's demand for evidence is not a category error. It is a vital defense of the methodology that allows us to reliably separate objective reality from subjective interpretation. If we blur those lines, we risk equating deeply felt personal metaphors with the universal laws of physics, and we lose our ability to definitively agree on what is real.
That is a strong stance. Despite our distinct framings, though, I believe we share common ground on what this discourse ultimately reveals.
I think we do.
This exchange serves as a vivid demonstration that human beings inevitably rely on invisible architectures to make sense of the world.
Absolutely. Whether we are attempting to map the macrocosmos through the rigorous mathematics of theoretical physics, or attempting to map the microscopic movements of our own consciousness through spiritual inquiry, we are all just striving to articulate the unseen forces that dictate our reality.
Beautifully said. There is immense depth left to explore in this subject, particularly regarding how we conduct experiments in our own inner laboratories and whether those subjective findings can ever truly bridge the gap to objective science.
Plenty more to dig into.
Indeed. We leave it to you, the listener, to reflect on your own invisible architectures. Where do you place your trust in the unseen? And when you examine the trajectory of your own life, are you being pulled by the gravity of your attachments or by the quiet magnetism of liberation?
Something to think about.
Keep questioning the fields that move you.